The Godfather film series, the video game Mafia, and Old Country are stories about bloody showdowns in Sicily, family honor, and the code of silence. Omerta created the image of the terrifying Italian mafia, which appears as a closed brotherhood with its own rules, courts, and laws, where all conflicts are resolved within the clan, and turning to the state is considered ratting and betrayal. The real story of the Italian mafia is less romantic and much more dangerous. In reality, the code of honor often ended where the prospect of life imprisonment began. After the large-scale arrests in the 1990s, hundreds of mafiosi became informants in exchange for reduced sentences, breaking all schemes and connections. And the biggest mistake is to think that criminal organizations exist separately and outside the state. Why? Because the power of the mafia has never come only from weapons, racketeering, or drug trafficking. Its main weapon was the ability to infiltrate places where decisions are made: city halls, courts, procurement, political parties, and parliament. The history of modern Italy is a story of many years of coexistence between the state and criminal clans, business, and the political elite. Italy became the birthplace of the most famous criminal networks: the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the Camorra, a Neapolitan organization from the Campania region, which maintained its power through control over retail trade, construction, and waste disposal. The 'Ndrangheta is a Calabrian clan that for a long time remained in the shadow of the previous two, but today generates revenues equal to about 5% of Italy's GDP. According to the Demoscopica Research Institute, the annual turnover of this clan reaches 53 billion euros. If the 'Ndrangheta were a company, it would be one of the largest in Italy, surpassing legitimate industrial giants. And all this was happening in one of the richest countries in the world. Italy is a member of the G7, one of the founding members of the European Union, and the 7th largest economy in the world by nominal GDP. However, at the same time, in terms of GDP growth, Italy is a persistent laggard in the Eurozone, ranking among the 3 weakest economies in the EU in 2025. According to estimates by the European Commission, Italy's economic growth slowed to 0.7% in 2024 and is expected to slow further to 0.4% in 2025. At the same time, the average growth rate of the Eurozone in 2025 is about 1.5%. That means the Italian economy is growing almost 3 times slower than its European partners on average. The mafia in Italy has merged with the state through control over government procurement, construction tenders, and local politics in the south. Politicians received votes. Business, contracts, mafia, money. The only ones who lost out were the taxpayers and the development of the country. This is a story about how organized crime learned to operate not against the state, but through the state, and about how, in 1992, this began to fall apart. That year, 2 fronts of war erupted at the same time. In Sicily, anti-mafia judges launched an unprecedented offensive against mafia clans. In Milan, prosecutors launched the Clean Hands investigation, which exposed a system of political corruption that had permeated almost all of the country's leading parties for decades. Within a matter of months, the political system that had governed Italy for nearly half a century collapsed. Parties disappeared. Dozens of ministers, deputies, mayors, and businessmen found themselves under investigation. And the country itself entered a crisis that historians call the transition from the First to the Second Republic. In this video, we will figure out how the mafia managed to penetrate the very heart of a democratic state and became a co-owner of the state, how Italy tried to break this alliance, and how it affected the development of the state today. Modern mafia. It's no longer just people with weapons in dark alleys. These are shell companies, government tenders, financial flows, suspicious transactions, and schemes that are often seen not in movies, but in spreadsheets. That's why today, it's not just prosecutors fighting corruption and fraud, but also people who know how to work with data, find anomalies, see connections, and understand where money disappears into the shadows. While some see just numbers, others see risks, decisions, and a career with IT-level pay. If you feel exhausted and have hit a financial ceiling, It's time to change your field. Data analytics at GoIT is the brains of business. You analyze data and tell the company what brought success and what wasted the budget. It's stability, the freedom to work remotely, and getting paid for your skills, not just the hours you put in. Don't just take my word for it. Try it yourself. Sign up for the free online intensive from GoIT. Write your first SQL code and understand how data drives the world. No risks. The QR code is on the screen. We'll leave the link in the description. Check it out. The Italian Mafia was formed as a response to the failure of the state after the unification of Italy in 1861, when the Piedmontese government abruptly introduced centralized taxes, conscription, and land reforms, but did not create an effective mechanism for enforcing the laws. A power vacuum emerged, and someone had to fill it. In Sicily, a system of latifundia, huge estates, had prevailed for centuries, with the owners living in cities and never appearing on their own lands. These lands were managed by intermediaries, tenants, and overseers. They hired armed guards, called campieri, to protect the estates from bandits in a lawless environment. These private armies gradually realized their own power. At first, they protected the owners. Then they started demanding money from them for protection. And eventually, they became the real power locally, stronger than the state. In the mid-19th century, Western Sicily dominated global citrus production. Lemons and oranges were bought in large quantities across Northern Europe, and the British Navy purchased limes by the ton to fight scurvy. Lemon groves required large capital investments. The mafia emerged where the state was weakest and the economic value was highest. It sold what the state was supposed to provide: protection of property rights. As long as institutions are not established in the state, the demand for private protection remains. Historically, 4 separate organizations have formed, each with its own logic. Cosa Nostra is the Sicilian Mafia, the oldest and most well-known in the West. It was the one originally called the Mafia. It has a centralized structure with a hierarchy of families and a commission that coordinates the clans. Camorra is a Neapolitan organization from the Campania region. Most historians believe that it originated in the prison gangs of Naples shortly before the unification of Italy. Its main difference is the absence of a single center. There are about 180 independent clans that control areas of Naples and its surroundings, sometimes forming alliances and sometimes fighting each other. The 'Ndrangheta is a Calabrian clan that remained in the shadows the longest, and today it is the most powerful. Unlike the Sicilian Mafia, the basic units are built on blood relations. The family and its relatives control all illegal operations in their territory. This makes the organization almost impenetrable to investigation. It is precisely because of this cohesion that the 'Ndrangheta has come to dominate European drug trafficking. In 2023, Italian authorities carried out the largest operation against the 'Ndrangheta, arresting 132 members in 10 countries: Belgium, Germany, Italy, France, Portugal, Slovenia, Spain, Romania, Brazil, and Panama. The modern Italian judicial system has deployed an unprecedented legal and enforcement apparatus against these syndicates. The first tool is the strict prison regime 41 bis, created specifically for mafia leaders. It involves complete isolation in a solitary cell, round-the-clock video surveillance, limiting visits to 1 per month through bulletproof glass, and strict control of all correspondence in order to completely cut the boss off from the ability to run the clan from prison. At the same time, there is the institution of repentance, the Witness Protection Program, which offers former mafiosi a significant reduction in prison terms and a change of identity for the whole family in exchange for breaking their silence. This allows courts to conduct massive maxi trials, where hundreds of members of the same syndicate stand trial at the same time. This happened during a large-scale judicial strike against the 'Ndrangheta, when, in a coordinated operation, the Italian authorities arrested 132 members of the group simultaneously in 10 countries around the world. The main nightmare for a modern mafioso is not so much prison, but rather the loss of status and money. That's why Italian courts actively use the mechanism of preventive confiscation of property based on the Rognoni La Torre law. Prosecutors don't need to wait for the final court verdict. If the financial police see that the suspect's official income is minimal, but he actually owns assets worth millions of euros, the court immediately freezes and seizes the property, shifting the burden of proving the legality of the money onto the owner himself. Moreover, confiscated villas are handed over for use as kindergartens or police stations, and criminally acquired land is given to agricultural cooperatives that produce legal products. Since modern criminal leaders have moved into the digital space, the courts have been authorized to wage a total digital war. Mafia-related provisions are the only ones under which judges allow the remote infection of suspects' smartphones with government spyware. Spyware that can secretly turn on the microphone and camera at any moment. And wiretaps may be recorded without any time or location restrictions. To protect the legal economy, the judicial system together with the prefectures uses an anti-mafia ban. If the court sees even an indirect connection between a commercial firm and a criminal clan, the company immediately loses the right to participate in government tenders. Its licenses are revoked and its accounts are frozen, which means financial death for shell companies. If criminals infiltrate local government, a special judicial administrative commission has the right to completely dissolve the city council or mayor's office, dismiss the deputies and the mayor, and transfer the management of the city to special commissioners for up to 2 years. From Rome for the full cleanup of budget-funded companies. More than 1 in 5 retailers in Italy give part of their revenue to racketeers, and at least 20 businesses face extortion. For most companies, it's easier to make a deal with criminals than to oppose them. The presence of organized crime over the 30 years from the mid-1970s to the mid-2000s caused a 20% cumulative loss of per capita GDP in Italy. Comparing the actual and hypothetical development of regions shows that the presence of the mafia in a region reduces per capita GDP by 16% due to the substitution of private capital with less productive public investments. This is a vicious cycle that perpetuates itself for decades. Only 1 out of 10 foreign investors in Italy establishes companies in the south of the country. The rest go to the north, where the courts work, where contracts are enforced, and where there is no risk that someone will come to you with an offer. As of 2025-2026, this vicious cycle has undergone changes. The era of open extortion has mostly become a thing of the past, giving way to a silent mafia. The source of enrichment for criminal clans has become the financial flows of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, under which Italy received more than 190 billion euros from the European Union. Between 2021 and 2024, more than 1,300 suspicious financial transactions related to government tenders were detected. The mafia infiltrated the legal business sector through networks of shell companies, forgery of financial guarantees, and participation in government tenders for construction and green energy. On February 17, 1992, Mario Chiesa was detained in Milan. He was a minor socialist official, the director of a city shelter for the elderly. During the search, he tried to flush $4,500 down the toilet, money he had received for a cleaning contract. This was an ordinary case. It became the starting point for a large-scale anti-corruption investigation in Italy. The leader of the Socialist Party, Benito Craxi, publicly called Chiesa a thief, a renegade of the party, which itself has nothing to do with corruption. After public criticism from the party leader, Chiesa agreed to cooperate with the investigation and gave testimony that exposed systemic corruption at the national level. The investigation, led by Judge Antonio Di Pietro, quickly spread across the country, triggering a domino effect among politicians and officials. One official named names, and those people told on others. The investigation went far beyond Milan. By March 1993, 7 people who were to be questioned as suspects had taken their own lives. By the end of that same year, the police had tracked over 620 billion lire in bribes, or $394 million paid to politicians. In total, about 4,800 people were arrested. At one point, More than half of the members of the Italian parliament were under investigation. Over 400 city and district councils were dissolved due to corruption charges. When it became clear that the scale of the scandal was devastating, the authorities tried to stop the investigation through legislation. In March 1993, the government prepared a decree that allowed criminal charges for bribery to be replaced with administrative ones, which effectively meant amnesty for most of the suspects. Mass protests swept across the country. The President of the Republic, Oscar Luigi Scalfaro, refused to sign the decree, declaring it unconstitutional. Then there was a new scandal, this time involving $250 million connected to the state company Eni. This was about the Eni Mont case, a joint venture between the state-owned Eni and the private chemical giant Mont Edison during its merger and subsequent sale. According to investigators, more than $90 million in kickbacks ended up in the pockets of leading politicians, including 2 former prime ministers. The 1994 elections were so revolutionary that they are officially considered the end of the First Republic of Italy. They ushered in a new era and new politicians, including the media tycoon and populist Silvio Berlusconi. Despite the scale, the result was controversial. More than half of the roughly 3,000 people arrested ultimately avoided punishment because the statute of limitations expired. The investigation destroyed the parties, but it did not destroy the system that bred corruption. The courts remained slow. Procedural loopholes and political practices were partially reproduced over time by the new elites. After the collapse of the old party system, Italy tried to change the political rules of the game. In 1993, a referendum introduced a mixed electoral system instead of an almost entirely proportional one. The goal was clear: to reduce the fragmentation of parliament, weaken the power of party machines, and make the government more stable. Later, in 2014, Italy also effectively abandoned direct state funding of parties, becoming one of the few countries in the European Union with such a model. It is telling that after the explosion of the Mani Pulite, clean hands scandal, the issue of corruption gradually disappeared from the center of the Italian political agenda, even though the problem itself did not go away. Since 1995, when Transparency International began publishing the Corruption Perceptions Index, Italy has consistently shown one of the worst results among Western European countries. The country received its lowest score in 2010 with only 39 points out of 100. In 2025, Italy has 53 points, which is still below the EU average, which hovers around 64 points. From 2010 to 2014, Italy ranked between 69th and 72nd place in terms of corruption. Then the situation began to improve. By 2025, it was already in 52nd place, but this is still the worst result among Western European countries. So despite some reforms, Italy still has not been able to completely eliminate the systemic incentives for political corruption and delays in justice. Italian corruption has historically had a much darker side, a direct connection with organized crime. The anti-corruption Operation Clean Hands not only destroyed Italy's old political system, but also proved that the Mafia was a systemic partner of the highest political circles in Rome. Criminal syndicates funded top politicians' campaigns for years in return for government contracts, tax breaks, and favorable court rulings. Only after the state tried to sever these ties did the Mafia, and adjustments to court verdicts through loyal judges. An open war carrying out a series of terrorist attacks and killing leading anti-mafia judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in 1992. This explosion of violence forced the Italian justice system to develop unique, the toughest measures. Side, directly organized by political forces in Rome. A direct consequence of the collapse of the old party system after the scandal was the emergence of Silvio Berlusconi, the Prime Minister of Italy and one of the wealthiest media tycoons. The Christian Democrats and Socialists lost the trust of the voters, and the traditional center-right camp essentially fell apart. A political vacuum was created, which Berlusconi filled with the help of his own business empire and media. In 1994, he created the Forza Italia Party, or Forward Italy, which was built as a corporate political project. The organizational structure was provided by the Fininvest holding, and the main tool for mobilization became the Mediaset television channels. At that time, Berlusconi's media assets covered 90% of the Italian TV audience. For the first time in a major Western democracy, the owner of a media empire directly turned television influence into political power. The collapse of the old parties undermined trust in professional politicians, and Berlusconi sold voters the image of a successful manager who supposedly didn't depend on corrupt schemes because he was already a billionaire. The campaign was built primarily on the marketing logic of television: personalization, simple messages, constant media presence, and the image of a man outside the system. At the same time, the conflict of interest was obvious from the very beginning. Already as prime minister, Berlusconi simultaneously controlled the country's largest private media group and had significant influence over the state broadcaster RAI through government appointments. As a result, a significant part of the television space ended up under the control of the head of government. The Council of Europe and international media groups have long criticized Italy for concentrating media power in the hands of the prime minister. In 2001, Berlusconi turned the election campaign into a televised political performance. Live on the popular talk show Porta, he signed a contract with the Italians. 5 specific commitments. The first, he promised to lower tax rates to 2 levels, 23% and 33%. To introduce a neighborhood policing system to guarantee safety in cities, raise minimum pensions to €516, reduce unemployment by half by creating 1.5 million new jobs, and launch at least 40 projects. From the large-scale plan for major infrastructure construction, Berlusconi promised Italians that he would not run in the next elections if his future government fails to fulfill at least 2 out of the 5 mentioned points. However, when the 5-year term as prime minister ended in 2006, he had no hesitation in leading the election campaign again, despite the fact that independent economic analysts declared the contract completely unfulfilled. Between 2001 and 2007, Italy's average real GDP growth was only about 1.2% per year. That's about half as much as the average in the Eurozone. The promised 2 tax rates were never implemented. Instead, the number of existing rates was adjusted, and the pressure on taxpayers decreased only symbolically by 0.1 from 40.7 to 40.6% of GDP. Unemployment fell. From 9.6% employment increased by about 1/3. Employment increased by about 1.22 million people. But more than 600,000 of these new jobs were jobs held by illegal migrants, legalized through the Bossi-Fini law. A pension increase was received by 1.8 million pensioners out of 5.9 million. To fully fulfill the promise, it would take from 11 to 17 billion euros per year, about 1.5% of GDP. Berlusconi limited the increase only to those who were already 70 years old, with a household income of no more than 6,800 euros per year. In reality, the actual start of construction on infrastructure projects amounted to only 21.4% of the planned investment volume, not 40% as promised. Despite anemic economic growth throughout the entire decade, voters did not actually hold Berlusconi accountable. Berlusconi was not held accountable for the lack of reforms that could have boosted entrepreneurial activity, production, and employment. At the same time, Berlusconi and his governments systematically promoted laws that critics called leggi ad personam, laws tailored for a specific person, and it was about limiting the powers of the prosecutor's office and attempts to grant immunity to the highest officials of the state. That is, the political system that emerged after the anti-corruption upheaval of the 1990s ultimately did not eliminate the dependence of politics on big money and influence. It only changed its form. Instead of the party corruption of the First Republic era, Italy entered an era of personalized media politics and conflicts of interest at the highest level. The autumn of 2011 was the moment when the chronic debt burden and endless political scandals surrounding Berlusconi brought the economy to the brink of financial collapse. The country's national debt soared to a critical level, reaching 119.6% of GDP, which in monetary terms amounted to 1.9 trillion euros. This exceeded the combined debts of Greece, Ireland, and Portugal together. After the global recession of 2008-2009, the Italian economy completely lost its momentum and stagnated, showing only symbolic growth in the range of 0.4 to 0.6% per year. At this moment, the panic in the markets was finally legitimized by the leading global rating agencies. Standard & Poor's and Moody's sharply downgraded the country's sovereign rating due to weak economic growth and the loss of confidence in the Berlusconi government. Moody's at that time made an unprecedented move by cutting the rating by 3 notches at once. This triggered a chain reaction. Large funds and banks began selling Italian government bonds en masse, since according to the rules, many investors cannot hold securities with a downgraded rating. In November 2011, the yield on Italy's 10-year bonds reached 7% per year, which in financial markets is considered a signal of the risk of a country losing its solvency. At such interest rates, servicing the debt becomes so expensive that the budget is mainly used to pay interest, crowding out funding for other areas. The European Central Bank and international creditors made it clear that they did not believe in the government's ability to stabilize the situation. Facing the threat of default, Berlusconi resigned, making way for the crisis management government of Mario Monti, whose sole task was to urgently put out the fire in the financial markets. In total, Berlusconi served as prime minister 4 times and spent 9 years in office. Over these years, Berlusconi went through 35 criminal cases for corruption, tax evasion, false accounting amounting to about 250 million euros, and embezzlement of state funds totaling over 5 million euros. Only one case ended with an actual sentence of 4 years in prison for tax fraud in 2013. The outcomes of 6 previous cases were changed by laws passed by his own parliamentary majority. By the end of 2009, Italy's GDP had fallen by 5.3%. This was the 3rd deepest economic recession in Ukraine since World War II. Italy found itself in the so-called lost decade, never returning to pre-crisis GDP levels even after 10 years. The overall unemployment rate in Italy during the crisis jumped to 8.4 in 2010 and continued to rise, surpassing 12.7 in 2017. The real tragedy was the youth. While the average unemployment rate was 33% between 1994 and 2000 by 2016, it had reached almost 40%. In the southern regions, the situation was even worse. Youth unemployment there exceeded 40% in some areas, which led to a mass emigration of the most talented graduates to the United Kingdom, Germany, and the United States. The financial crisis exacerbated the problem of inefficient state institutions, as funds continued to disappear into the shadow economy. During the period of 2008 to 2009, the shadow economy accounted for 23 to 27% of GDP, more than 250 billion euros. And according to the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, Italy ranked 63rd in the world in 2009 alongside Cuba. For 20 years since the 2000s, the Italian economy has stagnated. The country gradually lost its competitiveness relative to the Eurozone by about 30% compared to Germany. In the last 15 years, it has accumulated an economic growth gap of about 10% with Spain, 14% with France, and 17% with Germany. The main reason is weak labor productivity growth. In 2024, it remains below the European Union average and significantly lower than France and Germany. During the same period, while France increased productivity from $57 to over $65 per hour worked, and Germany from 56 to almost 69, Italy fluctuated between $52 and $55. Essentially, there was no progress. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the average real annual salary in Italy decreased from about $50,500 in 2000 to $48,900 in 2023. During the same period, Germany increased from $57,300 to $65,700. France from $49,800 to over $59,000. So in a quarter of a century, real salaries in Italy have decreased. Such stagnation suppresses domestic demand and makes the country less attractive for qualified professionals. Another populist project. The Northern League Party claimed that the economic productivity of the North is undermined by the redistribution of funds by the central government in favor of the poorer South. This resonated with the Northern electorate, given decades of subsidies and zero progress in convergence. But instead of questioning the quality of institutions and the real reason for the failure of state programs, the League found a simpler answer. The party's founder, Umberto Bossi, regularly called the inhabitants of the South lazy parasites who live off the hard-working Northerners. The party's promotional materials depicted the North as productive and the South as a burden. Partly, this is a structural problem of the economy. About a third of Italian workers do not meet the requirements of their jobs. This is the highest rate among the countries studied, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. 1 in 5 considers themselves underqualified, while more than a third are rated as insufficiently prepared by employers. Education is not keeping up with the needs of productive companies, and universities poorly signal their graduates' actual competencies. The second long-term factor is demographics. Italy's population is aging, and its birth rate is one of the lowest in Europe, 1.14 children per woman. The population is aging rapidly, and pension expenses already reach about 15.6% of GDP compared to the European Union average of less than 13%. If today, 3 working people support 2 non-working people, by 2050, the ratio will even out. Because of this, the burden on the system will only increase. If today, 3 working people support 2 non-working people, by 2050, the ratio may approach 1-to-1. This means slower economic growth, higher tax pressure, and increasing government spending on the social system. The third problem is the judicial and regulatory system. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development directly points out, reforms in civil justice and public administration should support business investments and accelerate the implementation of government projects. Italy consistently ranks among the countries with the longest duration for civil and commercial case proceedings in the EU. Foreign investors factor judicial risk into their decisions. According to the World Bank, direct foreign investment in Italy in 2024 amounted to only 1.13% of GDP, lower than in 2023. The global average is 4.17% of GDP. Italy's average from 1970 to 2024 is only 0.72% of GDP. For comparison, in Spain, according to the UNCTAD World Investment Report, 2024 inbound foreign direct investment was about 3.5% of GDP. In France, it's over 2.5%. In Germany, it's about 1.2%. The total accumulated volume of direct foreign investment in Italy is $493.5 billion, which is a relatively modest figure for the third largest economy in the EU. The reason is not the lack of attractive assets, but rather the quality of the environment. Bureaucracy, complicated approvals, and slow courts increase the cost of doing business and make investments less predictable. According to the Rule of Law Index, Italy ranks 34th in the world. However, its real problem is illustrated by the regional breakdown. In the group of countries of the European Union, the European Free Trade Association, and North America, Italy is at the bottom, ranking 25th out of 31. The main anchor dragging the country down and preventing it from reaching the level of Germany, France, or the Northern European countries is the Civil Justice Subindex. The most important institutional problem that Italy has not solved is the statute of limitations for criminal cases. In Italy, the statute of limitations still starts from the moment the crime is committed and continues to run throughout the investigation, trial, and appeals without any possibility of stopping. Criminal proceedings in the court of first instance last an average of 4 to 5 years, appeals add another 3 years. If the defendant can hire costly lawyers, the case remains open, but it's easy to drag it out until the statute of limitations runs out. Most European countries stop the statute of limitations after the indictment is filed or after the first verdict. Only in Greece and Italy, the two most corrupt countries in the Eurozone, are court cases systematically cut short during appeals. The offender files an appeal not to win the case on its merits, but simply to wait until the statute of limitations expires. In 2005, the Berlusconi government contributed to this. It quickly shortened the statute of limitations. The opposition harshly criticized these laws, but when they came to power, they did not repeal them. The 2016 Transparency International report described the Italian statute of limitations rules as uniquely poorly designed. After years of criticism, Italy finally began to change the system. In 2019, Giuseppe Conte's government passed a reform that stopped the statute of limitations from running after a verdict by the court of first instance. And the reform by Justice Minister Marta Cartavia in 2021 tried to balance two problems at once: to prevent endless trials, but also not to allow people to avoid punishment solely by dragging out the court process. The slowness of justice, together with political corruption, has remained for decades one of the main factors behind Italians' distrust of the state. The long-standing lack of transparency and cronyism in the government directly affect young people, destroying their faith in fair career advancement and in meritocracy, the rule of the best. Corruption and economic stagnation have ultimately transformed into a deep demographic crisis. Seeing no prospects for getting ahead honestly at home, the younger generation is emigrating en masse. More than 1.3 million Italians officially moved abroad between 2012 and 2022, and more than 60% of them are under 35 years old. For every young foreigner who comes to Italy, 9 young Italians leave. According to the Northeast Ireland Foundation, the brain drain from Italy cost the country about 134 billion euros between 2011 and 2023. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development confirms Italy has one of the highest rates of skilled emigration. Among developed countries, it also has one of the lowest return rates. For comparison, among young professionals migrating between EU countries, only 1.9% choose Italy as their destination, whereas Germany, the United Kingdom, Spain, and France attract between 15 and 20% of this flow. Even small Denmark attracts 3.2%. Sweden attracts 3.4%. The problem of brain drain is also common in other southern European countries: Spain, Greece, Portugal, but with important differences. Spain produces more university graduates than its economy can absorb, and students who move to other EU countries have an employment rate 4 points higher than those who stayed. But in Spain and Portugal at least, there is some return migration. The warm climate, lower cost of living, and digital nomads partially offset the outflow. In Italy, this compensation is minimal. An outdated work visa system, complicated bureaucracy, and slow document processing make the country unattractive even for unskilled foreign workers. The main tool for attracting foreign labor is the Flow Decree. It annually sets quotas for the entry of non-EU citizens to work in Italy. The most absurd thing is that the system works on a first-come, first-served basis. Quotas are allocated in the order applications are received, and in some years, all available spots were filled within the first 15 minutes after opening. Out of 146,850 authorized entries in 2024, only 24,858 residence permits were actually issued. Less than 17% of the quota. Preliminary data for 2025 shows only 7.9%. Portugal and Greece, where salaries are lower or comparable to Italy, still attract more foreign specialists and digital nomads. simply because it's easier there to open an account, register, and get a residence permit. In October 2022, Giorgia Meloni and the Brothers of Italy party came to power. Meloni governed much more moderately than most people expected. She did not provoke a confrontation with the EU, did not destabilize the finances, and did not break the unity of the West regarding Ukraine. And on the positive side, in 2 years, Meloni has more than halved the budget deficit, and it is heading towards below 3% of GDP in 2026. The yield on 10-year government bonds has fallen to 3.7% and is now almost at the same level as the French ones, which indicates growing market confidence. Unlike Berlusconi, Meloni does not position herself as an entrepreneur, but her government has implemented a more concrete and structured set of measures for business, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. Meloni has expanded the Industry 4.0 program, which was introduced back in 2016. According to this program, companies that decide to invest receive a tax credit for investments in new technological assets. At the same time, in 2024, the Scale Up Act was adopted. This is a law for startups that increased tax deductions on investments up to 65% for individuals. It extended the innovative startup status up to 9 years for companies with long development cycles and provided benefits for accelerators and incubators. In the field of taxation, Meloni introduced a flat tax, that is, a single tax rate for everyone. The government raised the threshold for the 15% flat rate for freelancers and individual entrepreneurs. For new businesses, a 5% rate applies for the first 5 years. During the income tax reform in 2024, the number of rates was reduced from 4 to 3. Now, the 23% rate applies to incomes up to 28,000 euros per year instead of the previous 15,000. The second measure is the reduction of social contributions from salaries, by 7 for incomes up to 25,000 euros and by 6 for incomes up to 35,000 euros. In practice, this resulted in an average increase of about 100 euros per month for around 14 million workers. However, despite the declared goal of reducing taxes, the actual tax burden in 2025 increased to 43.1% of GDP, from 41.4% in 2023, and this is the highest level in several years. This happened because tax and contribution revenues increased by 4.2%, whereas nominal GDP grew by only 2.5%. In other words, the state extracted more growth from the economy than the economy itself actually generated. Despite these measures, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development notes in its report, barriers to trade and services remain significant. Regulation restrains competition in liberal professions and service sectors, and labor productivity continues to weaken. This is reflected in the growth rates. If in 2022, when Meloni came to power, Italy's GDP grew by 4.8%, then the growth rate dropped to 1% in 2023 and 0.7% in 2024. In 2025, Italy's growth was only 0.5%. Lower than France, there it was, 0.8%. And much lower than Spain. There it was, 2.8%. The most expensive and complicated part of Meloni's government is the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. This is the largest amount of EU funding ever allocated to any country in the program's history. The total amount allocated to Italy in 2019 was 71.8 billion euros in grants and 122.6 billion euros in loans. In total, 194.4 billion euros, or 10.8% of the country's GDP. As of August 2025, Italy had spent only 44.2% of these funds, 86 billion euros. Italy's absorption of EU structural funds in the previous cycle from 2014 to 2020 was 60%, the third lowest rate in the EU. Italy is carrying out the necessary reforms to receive the tranches, but bureaucracy and limited management capacity prevent the funds from being used on time. EU funds are scattered across small local projects with minimal economic impact, unlike the targeted approach of, for example, Spain, which directed them to support business innovation. Economists warn that without these funds, Italy could already be in a recession. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in its April report of 2026 states, barriers to trade in services in Italy remain significant compared to other countries in the organization. Productivity is growing weakly due to regulations that stifle competition, especially in the liberal professions and specialized services. Reforms are needed to lower entry barriers in the service sectors and to put concessions out to public tender. Despite all this, there are sectors in Italy that really work, and their success is not linked to government support, but rather has emerged in spite of government inefficiency. For example, small and medium-sized businesses in northeastern Italy, the so-called Third Italy, Emilia, Romagna, Venice, Tuscany, tourist regions that thrive thanks to thousands of small family businesses specializing in high-quality niche products. Leather goods, furniture, machinery, ceramics, food products. This is a model that emerged from the ground up, without large government programs, and has demonstrated long-term resilience. In 1987, Italy surpassed the United Kingdom in terms of economic size and became the fourth largest in the world, precisely thanks to the second economic miracle, which was based on small and medium-sized businesses. Now Italy is among the 5 most visited countries in the world and earns tens of billions of euros from this every year. Music playing. At first glance, Ukraine and Italy exist in completely different geographic and cultural contexts. However, the structure of their internal challenges, from a state captured by narrow interest groups to chronic corruption and the rise of populists, reveals a striking similarity. The Italian experience proves that even the most high-profile investigation cannot change the system without fundamental institutional reform. The epical anti-corruption campaign of the early 1990s crushed the old political elites. However, due to the lack of systemic legal changes, more than half of the 3,000 arrested officials avoided real punishment through trivial legal loopholes and the expiration of the statute of limitations. This gap allowed Silvio Berlusconi to come to power and reshape the legislation for his own court cases. For modern Ukraine, this comparison is more relevant than ever. Attempts to limit the independence of NABU and SAPO by expanding the powers of the Prosecutor General in July 2025 provoked harsh criticism from the European Commission and mass protests within the country. They clearly illustrate that pressure on anti-corruption bodies has not disappeared. Moreover, the issue of statutes of limitations is not a technical detail, but a lethal loophole that directly echoes the warnings of the European Commission regarding Ukraine, where procedural rules on the automatic closure of cases at the pre-trial investigation stage have already led to the collapse of several high-profile cases, turning justice into a sham. Another critical lesson concerns financial injections. Subsidies without functioning institutions are unable to develop regions. Despite hundreds of billions of euros pumped into the South during the second half of the 20th century, real convergence with the industrial North did not occur, and the income level there remained at the level of a century ago. Rome bet on mobile financial capital instead of long-term investments in human potential, education, and social institutions. As a result, the allocated funds dissolved in corruption schemes and the construction of unprofitable cathedrals in the desert. For Ukraine, in the context of the upcoming large-scale post-war reconstruction, this is the most serious warning. Without a transparent judicial system and an independent anti-corruption framework, foreign aid risks turning into endless stopgap fixes and projects that exist only on paper, which will only entrench backwardness, instead of stimulating self-sufficient economic growth. After the collapse of the old system, Italian voters spent decades voting for new faces, from Berlusconi to the comedian Grillo, who built their campaigns on harnessing public anger, pitting the common people against the corrupt elite. But they never managed to establish new rules of the game. For Ukraine, which aims to take bold steps and provisionally close EU accession talks by the end of 2028, anti-corruption slogans during elections must finally give way to real staffing and structural reinforcement of the law enforcement system. The main advantage of the Milan prosecutors, led by Antonio Di Pietro, was their real autonomy, whereas in Ukraine, the position of Prosecutor General still carries the risk of politicization. Unlike Italy, which had investigations but lacked systemic protection against elite counterattacks, Ukraine has already built a unique triad in the form of NABU, SAP, and HACC. However, for the stability of these bodies, international partners must strictly link financial assistance to a real list of guilty verdicts against corrupt top officials. However, the key and most promising difference between modern Ukraine and Italy in the 1990s lies in the presence of a mature and active civil society. Ukrainian specialized civil society organizations, independent journalists, investigators, and activists have become a full-fledged element of the nationwide anti-corruption architecture, capable of effectively putting pressure on the authorities and stopping destructive legislative initiatives, as happened during the crisis around the law on the independence of NABU in the summer of 2025. This internal immunity, combined with the strict framework requirements of Brussels, gives Ukraine a historic chance not to repeat Italy's mistakes. The agreed 10-point legal reform plan for 2026 and the integration structure with 33 chapters clearly indicate that the European path will be evaluated not by the number of adopted declarations, but by the real independence of judges and the inevitability of punishment. The Italian experience of 30 years of stagnation proves that destroying the old corrupt system without immediately building strong institutional walls only clears the ground for the emergence of new populist politicians.
This video was created with the support of the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. NED may not share the views and opinions expressed in the video.
Friends, we have an ambitious goal to reach 200,000 subscribers on the channel by the end of 2026. You might have been watching us for a long time and not even realize that you haven't subscribed. Subscribe to our channel and tell your relatives and friends about it. Also, give us a like and leave a comment under this video. We thank all our donors, patrons, and sponsors on YouTube. Every trivia you contribute brings economic prosperity and well-being closer to Ukraine, because we are not just making videos. We are informing voters who will choose real reformers. Help us with this. The link to support the price of the state is in the description.
На Ютубі. Кожна ваша гривня наближає в Україні економічне процвітання та добробут, адже ми не просто робимо відео, а просвіщаємо виборців, які обиратимуть справжніх реформаторів. Допоможіть нам у цьому. Посилання про підтримку ціни держави в описі.